Well, thank you ever so much. As someone who grew up in Greater Manchester and has very fond memories of visiting Manchester Museum next door, where on display you can find historical relics of all of the greatest civilizations of history, it is a particular pleasure to be with you today. While I left Manchester at the tender age of 18 to go and study at Cambridge University, later taking on a fellowship there, it is very much Manchester's industrial heritage and influence that first brought me to economic history. I don't know whether you know it, but I am descended from a very long line of cotton mill workers here in Manchester. And so I grew up being told stories from both of my grandmothers, stories of an age that was, in my childhood, rapidly vanishing before my eyes. Though the chimneys from the cotton mills still reached high into the sky, and I do remember on one school summer holiday venturing into one of the recently closed cotton mills and exploring and adventuring up its staircases and abandoned halls. Probably if my parents had known at the time, I probably would have got in trouble. So it was this history that first brought me to economic history and that led me down the route of thinking about probably the most important question that economists face. Why are some countries rich and others poor? In other words, why do people in some places live in relative comfort whilst people in others struggle simply to survive? Or in other words, what drives economic growth? And that was, of course, the question very much on the mind of Arthur Lewis here, the Nobel Prize winning economist, very much associated here with Manchester University. There is the title page of his book, The Theory of Economic Growth. When I was a student, that was the first theory of economic growth that I was taught, the Lewis model. So it's a double honor to be with you today. But that also brings me to John Heinl, also shown here in the bottom right. His work has had a powerful influence on the way that I think about the world, the way that I think about economic history, because what he really did was to break down the barriers between economic history and social history, to think about the interactions between, the formal economy, but then also the home, marriage, fertility, family. And that has had a powerful influence on my thinking. So it is an honor to be speaking for this lecture today. Let me say a very big thank you for inviting me here. But also, let me say from the beginning, I cannot give you all of the answers. And that is why we need the PhD students in this room, and even younger, the students in classrooms studying history, in places here in Greater Manchester and around Greater Manchester, why we need you, why we need you to bring new ideas, new thinking, your own passion to the subject, so that we can all together work to uncover what I like to see as, this recipe for economic growth, the thing that we are all looking for. Now, history is, in economic terms, one long and repeated story of rise and decline. It is the story of one civilization after another, amassing great wealth, achieving great things before falling into a ditch ready to be found by archaeologists, centuries or even millennia down the line. So from the spectacular collapse of the Bronze Age world, a collapse that brought the end of empires and also the disappearance of entire writing systems, to the fall of the Roman Empire, the stagnation that followed the Abbasid, Middle East, the Islamic Empire, the flourishing within the Islamic Empire in the medieval period, the stagnation that followed the golden age of China. With all of those things in mind, history is filled with surprises. The baton of economic prosperity is, in other words, always itching to change hands. The economies that are today at the top of the economic league tables bear little relation to those that would have been at the top of the metaphorical economic league tables, centuries and millennia ago. So how prosperous civilizations end up on the scrap heap of history, how others then overtake but then go on to suffer a similar fate, is something that has occupied the minds of many a historian. And I'm sure in part because they want to save their own civilization, their own economy from repeating that same fate. Numerous explanations have been put forward. I have Noah's Ark here. So what does this refer to? Well, a whole body of work that suggests that natural disasters, environmental degradation, and resource depletion can spell the end of civilizations. Also, warfare. This is from a series of paintings titled The Course of Empire, documenting the literal rise and fall of empires. And the title of this particular painting in the series is Destruction. So we can literally see a city on fire, people fleeing, people in hand-to-hand combat, spelling an end to this particular civilization. But then also there are theories that revolve around, vested interest groups, unhappy with progress, and so putting sands in the wheels of progress, the famous Luddites there. And also the idea that what happens over time is our economies develop these bloated bureaucracies, and those act as a check on continued progress. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this being in this type of situation and how productive you found it was when you were in that type of situation, but certainly it's something that I would very much recognize. So what I would like to do is to add an extra dimension to this story of rise and decline, to offer an extra piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And that is the half of the population that are women. The fact that women tend to be missing from the story of rise and decline is perhaps not surprising, because from famous figures like Genghis Khan, Hernan Cortez, Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, when we think about the movers and shakers of economic history, we tend to think about men. And indeed, it's men like these that stand in the center of our big former industrial cities. Here they are in the center of Birmingham, gilded, poring over the plans of the steam engine. But no, since we're not in Birmingham, here we are, some equivalent statues and paintings from around Greater Manchester. Anybody spot any of these characters? Samuel Gregg, we've already mentioned him. Samuel Gregg of Quarry Bank Mill. Cobden, here a statue from the city, fights for free trade. And anyone spot the final painting, the final statue? Turing. Okay. And I think as, economists, we tend to think of, there's a debate about, the relative contributions of these three groups of people. You've got your industrialists and your kind of business people or trading people. You've then got your economic and political revolutionaries. And then you've also got your scientists and inventors. There's a kind of tug of war in terms of, which of these groups of figures are most important in determining the fate of our economies. So we tend, when we think about the past, we tend to think about men being the people that were driving the action in one way or another. And when we think about women in the past, we tend to think of something like this. We tend to assume that women spent most of history as housewives, that men were the people out there earning money, and that women traded in an altogether different currency, the love that makes the world go round. That is a story of the past that I challenge in my latest book, Economica, A Global History of Women, Wealth and Power. And I show that contrary to public perceptions, from the very start of human history, women were there alongside men working to power the economy forward. And I think once we begin with that as a starting point, once we appreciate women's contribution to history's greatest civilizations, then the ups and downs in women's freedom to participate provides a new way of thinking about the ups and downs in economies, why economies can falter over time. So in particular, I identify women's economic freedom as being an important ingredient in economic prosperity, and that in virtually every successful civilization in history, women have been there at the heart of the economy. But in advance of their subsequent decline, women's rights and freedoms were rolled back. That is a story that has been repeated throughout history, and I think it is a story that should be perhaps ringing alarm bells today if we want to avoid repeating that mistake. So what I'm going to do now is to take you on a journey through global economic history from the Stone Age to the present day. We're going to pass through all of the most glittering civilizations, and I'm going to introduce you to some important female figures from economic history. And we will trace those ups and downs in women's freedom. Fasten your seatbelt because we are going at breakneck speed. Right. Okay, we're going to start in the Stone Age. We're going to start high on the hills in the Andes in Peru. In 2018, a body was discovered, a 9,000-year-old hunter, buried with this 24-piece hunting toolkit. When the body was first discovered, the assumption was that this was a male hunter, because the standard assumption in archaeology has long been if you find a body buried with hunting tools or with weapons, that it must be a man, because of man the hunter. One archaeologist pushed to have the body tested. It turns out that this was in fact a woman. Now, she must have been a prize hunter, because to be buried with this hunting toolkit, that hunting toolkit was valuable. Someone else could have used that toolkit. So the fact that she was buried with that toolkit suggested that she was being honored by her community, that she made an important contribution to the sustenance of her community. Now, since that discovery in 2018, archaeologists have looked back at other big game hunters across the Americas in the Stone Age. And it turns out that this hunter was not unique. In fact, 40% of big game hunters in the Stone Age in the Americas between the years about 12,000 BC and about 8 or 9,000 BC have now been shown to be female. And that was where I wanted to start Economica, because I think the idea of man the hunter casts such a shadow over modern day discussions about gender equality. When we fight for gender equality, we're sometimes told you're fighting human evolution, you're fighting history. Men and women have always done different things. And so, we've got to accept we're different and we give up on fighting for equality because we're different, we're not the same. So I wanted to cast away that shadow to begin with. Now, there's another good reason to start with Stone Age Peru, and that is that Peru went on to become one of the first major civilizations in human history. So 5,000 years ago, 5 notable civilizations across the world. I'm sure, with time we're going to come up with others, but so Peru, and seems to have been quite a complex economy in the sense that we know a lot of trade and exchange took place between the coastal regions and the highland regions. We can see that from the evidence of things like fish bones and shellfish in rubbish dumps in areas quite distant from the coast. It seems to have been a relatively peaceful society from what we can see, in the sense that there isn't much material evidence or images of warfare, and similarly there isn't much evidence of slavery. So perhaps a relatively peaceful economy of exchange, but it is one of the most active areas of archaeology right now. And new findings are all the time coming to light. In fact, just in the last few months, a whole new city in Peru, ancient Peru, has been discovered. So we're in very early days. In addition to Peru, of course, the Indus Valley, actually many similarities between Peru at this time and the Indus Valley in terms of, again, there isn't much evidence of things like warfare, of slavery, and also of the glorification of individual, political leaders. You don't get that in the Indus Valley. You do again get evidence of exchange across, peaceful exchange across long distances. I think those are 2 really interesting economies from the past that deserve a bit more attention. And then, of course, the places that are better known, Egypt, the land of the pyramids. Did you know that in the workers' cemetery at the Great Pyramids of Giza, 1/2 of the burials are women? 1/2 of the bodies buried there are women. China, of the Yellow River Valley fame. China, by legend, where silk was first invented, and by legend, first invented by a woman. And then also Mesopotamia, of course. So 5,000 years ago, these were 5 really notable civilizations. And there is one thing, at least, that they all had in common, and that is cloth making and women's dominance within the cloth making sector. And that brings me to my next character from economic history. A cloth maker from Mesopotamia lived 4,000 years ago, called Lamassi. She ran her own cloth-making business. Her daughter was involved in the business. How do we know about her business? We know about it because of the letters that she wrote to her husband, who lived 1,200 kilometers away here, in a trading colony in Anatolia. Those letters have survived because, of course, they were written in cuneiform on clay tablets rather than on parchment. And in those letters, we see how Lamassi would send lists of all the cloth that she was putting together to send up to her husband by pack animal to be traded on her behalf. We see in the letters the power that she had in the relationship. In fact, that, from the archaeological discoveries, there are plenty of letters of female cloth makers at this time, in charge of their own businesses. So we're talking 4,000 years ago here. this is the peak time of the Bronze Age. It's a time when we were mixing together tin and copper to produce this new revolutionary substance, bronze. It was also, we might say, the period of the first big trade boom in human history. A trade boom built on going in search of tin. Tin not found in many places across the planet. So people had to travel far and wide to get the tin to then bring back to local copper mines to produce bronze. So Lamassy lived at a pivotal moment in history. Doubly so because this was a time when cloth was a central form of money. When cloth acted as a medium of exchange. So what is it that merchants were taking, in the side packs of their pack animals to travel all the way to places like Afghanistan in search of tin? It was cloth, rolls of cloth that they could then trade in return for the tin to bring back. So women indirectly, as cloth producers, were producing not just cloth to clothe us, but also money that was greasing the wheels of trade in this first major trade boom in human history. Sadly, women's ability to be involved in the informal economy, start businesses, trade, and all of that started to suffer. Their rights started to be rolled back. And, if we're going to blame anyone here, I think he might be someone who features in the Bible. You can tell me. King Hammurabi. Anyone heard of King Hammurabi? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that whole kind of legal code. He also introduced the first legal system of guardianship, making women the property of their fathers and then their husbands. And that had a serious effect on women's ability to, for example, sign contracts in their own name. And so to be trusted in terms of business deals and buying and selling. So what starts to happen, so here we're talking about the 1700s BC, is from that point on, women start to appear less, for example, in courtrooms as witnesses. Women beer sellers start to disappear. All female institutions, the equivalent of convents, start to either close down or be put a man appointed to lead them rather than a woman. And then as the Assyrian Empire expands, women increasingly veiled, secluded, closeted. By 1200 BC, the Bronze Age economy was collapsing. Pyramid builders were going on strike. People were unhappy about the cost of living, about the job market. People were taking to the sea in small boats across the Mediterranean, in search of a better life. And all of that was creating anxiety. The Bronze Age economy collapsed. Constraining the rights of half of your population probably didn't help the economic situation. But out of that Bronze Age collapse, after a period of dark ages, like the first dark age in human history, arose a new age, the age of iron. Now, iron, because it is distributed much more liberally across the planet, was kind of an equalizing force. And so at this time in the Iron Age, you see the rise of more and more societies, civilizations, kingdoms, economies. Iron, a real step on from bronze because it enabled you to produce things like weapons and tools that were much more productive than your bronze ones. But this also brings us to the age of the classical world. And when we think about this time, we tend to think about ancient Greece, of course. But I think for us as economic historians, what's perhaps equally, or dare I say more interesting, are these, Lydia, the Phoenicians, Carthage, these parts of the Mediterranean. The ancient Greeks, well known for their poets, their philosophers, their playwrights, their politics even, not so well known for their economic success stories. And that's in part, I think, because women lived very restricted lives in ancient Athens. Lives in which there was a strict guardianship system, a system in which women were expected to veil, to seclude themselves within the home. And that, I think, acted as a severe constraint on the Athenian economy. What's interesting is that Greek travelers, when they traveled here to Lydia, of course, some might see Lydia as the birthplace of coins, so this is the time that we tend to think about money in the sense we think of today being invented by the Lydians. And also the Phoenicians, when Greek travelers went to these places and up here to the Etruscans, the pre-Romans, what they commented on was the promiscuity of the women, the visibility of the women. In fact, they had these stories that all women were sex workers and built their dowries through sex work. They were shocked, in other words, by the visibility of women on the streets, in the marketplace, and the only way they could explain it was they must be sex workers. Because if you're a respectable woman, what are you doing in the marketplace, out on the streets? You should be in the home. So the Lydians, seen as the birthplace of money. The Phoenicians, the birthplace of navigation techniques and sailing. Carthage that comes out of that, where we see the development of the empire of Carthage, this kind of peaceful, free trading empire across the Western Mediterranean. These are places that were economically very successful and where women were much freer than Athens, less economically successful, and women less free. But I want to take you to the descendants, really, of the Etruscans, and that is to the Romans, to give you a practical example. This lady, Julia Felix. So Julia Felix was a property developer in Roman Pompeii. So if Donald Trump was the property developer of New York, she was his equivalent in Roman Pompeii. She owned an apartment building, she owned an entertainment and recreation complex, she had dining rooms, so restaurants, she had baths, Roman baths. Of course, in the Roman world, you've got to have Roman baths. And she decorated her buildings not with scenes from Roman mythology, but with market scenes, everyday market scenes, images of wagons carting goods to marketplaces, images of people trading, over a market stall. Her, entertainment palace was designed for the bourgeoisie, for people who made their way in the world through trade, through business, people who wanted to be surrounded by these images, not by images of gods and goddesses and, big battles. Now, she came from relatively humble roots. Historians who are specialists in Pompeii think she probably descended from a family of freed slaves, also that she may well have been illegitimate, because she is described in the written sources as the daughter of Spurius. And, we know what spurious means. Spurious, ? She's the daughter of we don't know who. And yet she amassed this property fortune. And again, she was not alone as a female entrepreneur in the Roman world. Roman women owned ships and shops, and they traded their wine and olive oil right across the Mediterranean. And, I think that is an important piece of the jigsaw puzzle in terms of understanding why the Romans became so much more economically successful than the Athenians. But we know the Roman world didn't last forever. 2,000 years ago, Roman society was in a moral panic. It was in a moral panic about falling fertility rates. It was in a moral panic about women choosing not to get married and instead to work and earn money and start businesses. It was also in a moral panic about immigration. And starting really as early as Augustus, the man that oversaw the transformation from the Republic to the empire, emperors started to fan the flames of this social discontent. They offered a solution to all of those supposed problems, and that was to push women into the home. How do you solve falling fertility rates, falling marriage rates, immigration? You get women to breed for the good of Rome. So Augustus's mantra was, if we want to preserve Roman traditions, Roman purity, we need women to breed. Did it help the Roman economy to constrain the freedoms of one half of your population? No, and in fact, the Roman world, was increasingly moving towards this economy of exploitation, not just in terms of women, but in terms of, male and female slaves as well. The rise and the fall of the Roman Empire, I think, cannot be explained without putting women's freedoms at the heart of that story. Out of the disintegration, as Europe is disintegrating after the collapse of the Roman Empire, economic prosperity is moving in a different direction in a neighboring part of the world, the Middle East. And I think that's in no small part thanks to another of my famous female figures from economic history, Khadija. So she was a wealthy merchant, a trader from Mecca. She traded cloth, animal skins, leather, right across the Arabian desert. She traded as far north as the Byzantine Empire, so the part of the Roman world that survived, south to Yemen, out to the eastern edges of Africa, to places like Ethiopia. She was a very busy lady, but she also therefore needed staff she could rely on. And she heard about this guy, and he had a reputation for hard work and for honesty. And so she said, "You're my man." She employed him to look after her camels on the ground, to take her wares, across the desert and to do her deals. She then later proposed to this man. After they got married, he then supposedly went up a mountain and heard the word of God, and Islam was born. Khadija's wealth then funded this initial expansion of Islam across the Arabian desert. But more than that, her influence as a merchant, as a trader, alongside his, acted as, a role model for the commercialization of the Islamic empire. And boy, did commercialization prove to be a great diffuser of religion, across the world. Here is the Islamic world in the 9th century, spreading all the way from Mecca out, eastwards through Persia, touching India, out across North Africa and up into Spain. This was an amazingly successful empire. Islam spread far more quickly than Christianity. Of course, Christianity at the time, one where merchants, trade, they were not seen as role models, they were looked down on. And so Christians would very often contract out their trading activity to Muslims or Jews. Because Muslims traded directly, they took their religion with them. The Islamic world spread not just through conquest, but through trade. But again, women's rights didn't last forever. Khadija, her ability as a woman to run her own business, that was becoming less and less common. Over time, women increasingly secluded, increasingly veiled, increasingly pushed into the home. Now, sure, women fought back, and in particular, women in Yemen, women in Egypt, women out here in India, but they didn't always win. And let me tell you one example of that. Sharjah al-Dawr. Anyone heard of Shah al-Dawr? She's one of my favorite women from history. So during the time of the Crusades, and in particular the Crusades taking place in the middle of the 13th century, so when the Islamic world was going up against the Christian world in this fight, this clash of empires, during that time, Egypt was run by an Islamic ruler, approved by the Caliph over here, and he took as his wife a sex slave girl, a girl that had been a sex slave in the harem. It was very common for Islamic rulers at the time to do this. In fact, most Islamic caliphs at this time were born of enslaved women. So we have this pair running Egypt at this pivotal time of the Crusades. Now, the husband passes away, and so as not to destroy morale at this time of war, his wife, Shah al-Dawr, runs the country, runs the military strategy in his place. She manages to take the French king ransom. She charges a lot of money for the return of the French king. It boosts the Egyptian coffers. Everyone's celebrating. Won the Crusades, or at least this battle within the Crusades. You fought off the Christians, sent them packing. Now you can come clean. Sorry, my husband's dead. I'm in charge. Are you happy for me to stay in charge? People in Egypt, happy with that. She's done a good job. But she has to get the sign-off from the head of the Islamic Empire in Baghdad. So they request his permission. He sends an open letter back to the people of Egypt, an open letter to be read out, on the streets and squares to the people of Egypt. If you cannot find a man to rule you, I will send you one. In other words, women are not capable of ruling. You cannot have a female ruler. 2 years later, that caliph came to a very nasty end, because in 1258, the Mongols swept in to Baghdad, besieged Baghdad, and he met with a very grisly end. We might say it was his comeuppance. Again, it's a society in which you have increasingly constrained what women can do in your economy. Women are half of your economy. The dynamism being sucked out of the economy, leaving you vulnerable, incapable of defending yourself. So economic prosperity now instead shifting eastwards, not just to the land of the Mongols, but to China. Now we're still in the 13th century here. And of course, silk produced by women had long been the currency of the Silk Road that connected China with the rest of Eurasia. And there was a motto promoted by the state: men plow, women weave. Women were respected contributors to the economy. And at a time when taxes were collected largely in kind, the state collected taxes not just in grain, but in cloth. So women would be expected to spin or weave cloth for 6 weeks to 2 months every year to pay taxes to the state in the form of cloth. So women important, contributors to the economy. And we know that as you see the transition away from the Tang dynasty to the Song economy, we see this flourishing of commercial activity. We see women setting up businesses, engaging in paid work out there, visible in the economy. And that brings me to my next woman, Wang Daopo. Wang Daopo, an inventor as well as a cloth maker. At the age of 10, her parents tried to marry her off, and she was having none of it. So she ran away from home, she traveled along the river, she boarded a boat, she ended up, I think it was in Hainan Island, falling into the fold of the Li people, Li people. They taught her how, through cloth making, to become an financially independent woman. They were also developing some quite sophisticated, cloth making equipment, so that, a step on from the spinning wheel, so that you could spin 2-3 threads all at once. And then a carding machine, so that you can, with your raw cotton, get that ready for spinning. What she did was to, over time, further improve those techniques. And then once she'd made her own way in the world, to return home to mainland China. And those cotton machines then diffused across China. And we see the beginning of the cotton cloth revolution in China. This was a time when women could earn more for their families than their husbands. This was lucrative, a lucrative business. Again, you would think this would be really good for women. Okay, things are going well, economy's flourishing, women out there active in the economy doing lots of interesting things. Things start to turn backwards. And how does this play out in China? Families find a great way of extracting the value that women create in this society. And that is by rendering their daughters geographically immobile, binding the feet of their daughters such that they can't, like Huang Daopo, run off, pursue an independent life. They essentially become slaves within their own families. And we know from, evidence elsewhere, studies on this, that foot binding spreading further and faster in cloth making parts of China compared with more agricultural parts of China. Now, I don't know about the other ladies in this room. I'm not very good at sewing. If I had had my feet bound and had to, produce cloth for all of my life, I would have been a very unproductive member of society. This attempt to extract the value, extract the wealth that women were creating might have been a great strategy in the short term. In the long term, it was not a great strategy, because it meant that women were not free to make their own decisions about work, were not free to go out, start their own businesses, to instigate the next revolution, to get involved in new sectors, the next sectors of the economy. Again, sucking the lifeblood out of 1/2 of the population of your economy. Over in Europe, things start to move in a different direction. So at the very same time that you have high rates of child marriage in the Middle East, in India, in China, the parts of the world that had been, historically very wealthy. At the same time, you had high rates of child marriage there. At the same time that women were having their feet bound, women were being forced to veil, pushed into the home, secluded. At the same time that that was going on, women in Europe, unmarried women, were out there in the marketplace. And, we don't even have to look at, data on this. We can see it in any art gallery across Europe. I love wandering around art galleries in Europe and photographing all of the images of female workers, through the ages, because they are there. They are visible, so much so that they were captured by artists. It was normal for young women to go out, work, earn their own money. Here's the Royal Exchange in London, and at the end of the 17th century, around about 1/2 of the rental space was rented by women, women retailers at the end of the 17th century. Women were really big when it came to retail, and in fact, running all kinds of businesses. Here are just 2 examples of business cards of women from the 18th century, and this one you have in front of you. I have some spares here if anyone wants one. So this is the business card of a female shoemaker that had a shop at the heart of the City of London in 1735. The business card tells us that she sells all sorts of men's shoes, boots and slippers, likewise women's, fine shoes, clogs, slippers, at reasonable rates. It also tells us that merchants trading to the plantations may be furnished with all sorts of shoes. In the context of the time, this was an international businesswoman, selling her wares across the world. 1735, it's a time before street numbers became common. And so in terms of the address, at the Boot, so look for the Boot sign next door to the 3 Tons and Rummer in Grace Church Street. That's how you would identify her. And another example, so this is Mary Vinson. So this is her business card. She was a chimney sweep towards the end of the 18th century. Performs the chimney sweeping business in town or country in the completest manner. NB to be heard of at the Sun, the pub, Sun Pub in Ormond Street, and at the Swan near Queen Square. So in other words, if you want a reference, if you want to hear how good I am at cleaning chimneys, speak to people down the pub. They will tell you. But then several of the business goes about in my name to prejudice me. Be pleased to enquire if they belong to Mary Vinson. So any thoughts on what she's saying here? There's a scam going on. Other people are pretending to be me. There are other female chimney sweeps out there claiming to be Mary Vinson. Beware, if you want to have your chimneys properly cleaned, check it's the real Mary Vinson. So these come from a collection of business cards held in the British Museum. And they include examples of numerous female entrepreneurs. So we have hat makers, fan makers, shoemakers, cabinet makers, printers, goldsmiths, silversmiths. Women would do it, were out there visible, starting all kinds of businesses in the 18th century. And this is the advice from a very popular women's pamphlet, one that you would give to your daughter in the 18th century to help her navigate her life. So this is the time of Bridgerton. When we think of women sitting, sipping tea all day, discussing, who they're going to marry and arranging marriages for their daughters, was that, really how most women were living? Well, this tells us, none but a fool will take a wife whose bread must be earned solely by his labor and who will contribute nothing towards it herself. So in other words, daughter, you need to work. Don't expect to be financially dependent on men. It is normal in this economy for women to work. And in Economica, and also in one of my former books, I argue that it is this relative freedom of ordinary women that can help us understand why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain, and with it, how the West came not just to catch up with, but overtake parts of the world that had been ahead for a very long time. I think if you look at men's lives, whilst there are differences in men's lives on the eve of the Industrial Revolution in, say, Britain compared with China, India, the Middle East, whilst there are differences, I think there are even bigger differences in women's lives. And I think that mattered, since women are 1/2 of the population. So how did the freedoms of ordinary women help to sow the seeds, help to improve the economy? So there are at least 5 possible channels here. And these, it's not just me that talks about this. Clearly, there's a lot of research, a lot of literature on this that you can look to. So first possibility, when women go out and work and earn their own money, they're able to take charge of their personal life. They're able to take charge of the marriage decision. Rather than being married off as girls or as young teenagers, they can decide for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. And so I think one of the most notable differences between, say, Western Europe and other parts of the world at this time is that relatively high age of marriage of women. In Britain in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, the average age at which an ordinary woman got married was 25 or 26. This is not child marriage territory. It's remarkably modern, in fact. And that meant because women were marrying later, you're not breeding from the age of 13. You're having children later on in life. And that, of course, is going to impact population dynamics within your economy. And through that, the labour market, through that, wages. So, I don't know whether you do, but if you do subscribe to the Bob Allen high wage view of the British Industrial Revolution, then this is how ordinary women, by being able to take charge of their marriage decisions, are helping to support that higher wage economy that in turn incentivizes mechanization and the use of capital because labor is relatively expensive. Next possibility, again, if you're getting married at 25, 26 and then starting a family as opposed to at 13 and having a very big family, you can better afford to invest in the children that you have. So this helps to, in terms of the number of people, being apprenticed in the economy, the number of people being taught to read and write. This helps in terms of providing the skill base for the economy. So not just women's skills, but the fact that through the decisions they're able to make about work, family, and marriage, sons also potentially have greater access to apprenticeships and the ability to read and write. Similarly, investment. So if you're a family of this kind, then you're better able to afford to save and invest than if you have more mouths to feed. And that doesn't necessarily end up being channeled through the formal banking system, but what it can do is be channeled into, say, family businesses. Lots of family businesses, obviously, at this time. So in terms of technology, in terms of skills, and in terms of investment, I think women's freedom to make their own decisions in their life is helping to sow the seeds of these things. The Protestant work ethic, something that Max Weber famously talks about, this culture of working hard, saving hard, investing, is that really a result of Protestantism, or is it instead a result of the fact that people do leave home, get a job, and then have to set up their own household? And that in turn means you can't fall back on your parents. So you have to work hard, you have to save, otherwise you cannot afford a personal life, you cannot afford to get married, you cannot afford to have kids. So is it again women's freedom that is at the root of that? And then finally, political institutions, democratization. When women disrupt patriarchy within the family, they're also in turn disrupting systems of autocracy at the macro level. If you are brought up to shut up rather than to speak up, if you're brought up not to hold the elders in your family to account, not to question, to do as you're told, then when it comes to your wider political behavior, that socialization that happens in the home matters. When in the 17th century, the British king was fighting for his life, fighting the parliamentarians, fighting those who wanted, can roughly describe as greater democracy, he said to the British people, I'm going to paraphrase here, if you knock me off your pedestal, you knock every father off the pedestal within his own family. If I fall, every patriarch falls too. In other words, autocracy and patriarchy within the family stand and fall together. Once you disrupt one, you disrupt the other. So how, the push for democratization, but more than that, I mean, we We see it very much playing out today. There's democracy, but then there's sustaining democracy. And that sustaining democracy, which requires people to question, to hold to account, to speak up, that is equally as important. And I think that is rooted in these much freer lives that women had and much more gender equal families. I'm going to finish there with the Industrial Revolution. We could go on, but we are in Manchester, the home of the Industrial Revolution, so where better place to finish? And I'm also going to say that in the 19th century, things did for a while start to take a backward turn. Whilst women, I think, helped to sow the seeds of the Industrial Revolution, women were not paid back in return. Instead, they were increasingly pushed into the home. This is the trad wife. The trad wife is not trad. The trad wife is an invention of the Victorians. Fortunately, in the 20th century, women regained the ground that was lost and pushed even further. If we want to make sure that our own economies remain successful and build on our success, we cannot afford to repeat what has been the greatest mistake of human history, that is taking women's rights and freedoms for granted and rolling them back. And I think, sadly, we are on a knife edge right now when it comes to that. I'm a generally happy and optimistic person, but alarm bells are ringing in my ears when you look at certain parts of the world today. And I do think that in terms of standing up to that, history can be our greatest ammunition. If you have a view of the world in which men built the greatest civilizations of human history, if you have that view, what is there to lose from pushing women into the home? What is there to lose from making women trad wives? If instead you have a more accurate vision of history, one in which women alongside men built the great civilizations of the past, we can see how much there is to lose. We can stand up to modern day misogyny and, I hope, move forward rather than backwards. Thank you.